So a warm welcome to all of you who have joined in the first series of online European Peace Colloquy webinars. We have people joining from many different places, both Europe, the US, Canada, Australia, and the British Isles. Or at least we've had many people register from all those places, and we're very happy to have you here with us tonight. A very warm welcome to all of you. The theme of our webinar series is Peaceful Humanity, a New Creation, and we're excited about today's webinar and distinguished speaker and look forward to sharing in this learning time together. For this series, we've created a model of 7 dimensions of peace that we will be sharing at the beginning of every webinar. And every webinar after this one will illustrate one of these dimensions. We are calling today's webinar on human evolution and violence as foundational. Understanding our human biology in terms of violence and non-violence can help us be wiser and more realistic when working for peace and justice. I will now pass over to Andrew Bolton to introduce this evening's speaker.
Thank you, El Rey. I want to echo to you all El Rey's warm welcome. Thank you for being with us. It's my great pleasure to introduce Richard Wrangham, a distinguished primatologist and currently a professor of biological anthropology. He started his study of apes with Jane Goodall in Tanzania. Jane Goodall received the Community of Christ International Peace Award in 1999 at the first Peace Colloquy in Independence, Missouri that I organized. So there's a connection here. Richard Wrangham is British, but working at Harvard University in the States. He's written a wonderful book that El Rey's already mentioned that I'm holding up now, the Goodness Paradox, and is here to share some of the key ideas from that book. He's a humanist. This means he values the dignity of all human beings. But one of his ancestors was William Wilberforce, the anti-slavery British Member of Parliament and an evangelical Christian who led the successful campaign to abolish slavery throughout the British Empire in 1833. Professor Wrangham will speak for about 25 minutes and then will be open for questions. As El Rey has already indicated, please write your questions as they occur to you in the chat box and send them to El Rey. This means that the shyest among you can ask a question. It also means we don't interrupt the speaker. So, Professor Wrangham, thank you so much for being willing to share your time and expertise at this very first online European Peace Colloquy. A very warm welcome to you. Your audience is a diverse and international group with an interest in peace and justice. And we expect over 200 people to be listening to us this evening. We now look forward to your presentation. In a world of human kindness, why so much violence? Professor Wrangham, please give us the science, the fascinating story of our human evolution.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, El Rey. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is rather daunting because I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I suspect that most people who think about peace and war are thinking, or peace and violence, are thinking about it from a perspective that is much more immediate, much more to do with what goes on in the newspapers and what goes on in contemporary society than me. But I cherish the idea that that Andrew and others have organized here with this attempt to understand and think about peace and violence in all sorts of different ways. So I just want to emphasize that what I'm going to be doing is probably a bit foreign to you, but I believe it is part of a very exciting new approach to understanding, really in a deep way, how our species has come to be, and how our species has come to be in a way that has this extraordinary combination. Now, I'm going to try and share the screen at this point. Okay, so let's see if I can see it. It's reasonable. All right. So there's my question. In a world of human kindness, why so much violence. And what is peculiar about the human species, if you think about this from a point of view of comparing with some of our close relatives and other species in general, is that we have this amazing combination of, on the one hand, exceptional non-violence, where we are so tolerant, we're so kind, we're so cooperative, and at the same time, we have a quite exceptional degree of violence measured by just the number of people that in every society get killed in violent contexts and very often in war. Well, the reason that this is a very difficult problem is that ordinarily we tend to think of aggression along a single axis, represented in this cartoon version here. So either we're somewhere on the non-violent side on the left, or we're on the violent side on the right. And there have been classically two views about this. One is that we are inherently, naturally unaggressive. And that if you think about our evolved tendency, it's clearly on the left-hand side. This view is associated with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Rousseauian perspective. And what it says is that we come into the world naturally kind and tolerant. And if we end up with violence, that's because we've been corrupted by wicked things that goes on in society. Wicked ideologies, strange individuals who guide us down the wrong path, and so on. Then the other view is that we actually naturally end up on the right-hand side of this scale, on the more violent side, and humans are naturally a violent, chaotic, corrupt species. And this view is associated with Thomas Hobbes. So for 200 or 300 years, these two views have lain side by side, and the Hobbesian view is that we are naturally violent and that we need society to civilize us. So there's been a problem reconciling these two views and understanding which one is correct. Well, it seems very difficult to understand if we think we have to be on a single scale. How can we be at both ends on the scale of aggression? It doesn't make sense. But here, I think, is the answer. That we've been misled by using a single word, aggression, to characterize where we are, where we stand. And actually, for many decades, psychologists and biologists have recognized that there are two rather distinct forms of aggression, which I'll call proactive and reactive. So you see the proactive, there's a whole list of adjectives associated with it here. It's premeditated, it's controlled, it's planned, it's not necessarily emotional at all. Whereas reactive aggression is thoroughly emotional. This is what happens when you suddenly lose your temper, when somebody insults you or threatens you, and you lash out all over the place. And these two kinds of aggression have to be considered separately. And what I'm going to be saying is that the way to think about it with these two kinds of aggression in different ways is that the proactive aggression is something that humans are rather high on the scale of compared to other animals, whereas reactive aggression, we are very low on the scale. So we end up thinking of ourselves as a species that is kind and tolerant because we're low on the scale of reactive aggression, but nasty and cruel and violent because we're high on the scale of proactive aggression. And this is the mixture that is so peculiar about humans. So there we have the two types. Reactive aggression, being very low, enables humans to come together in large groups with strangers and not lose their tempers. It enables people to cooperate very well. It enables us to be kind and not always competitive. we often think that humans are sort of rather given to reactive aggression because you read about it in the newspapers, but that's the point. The fact that it's so rare in general in humans means that when there is a fight with people lashing out at each other, it's big news. Proactive aggression, on the other hand, is responsible for most of the violence that takes place in wars. So proactive aggression is planned aggression. It's planned by groups very often in humans. And if you think about the nature of war, it's a series of exchanges of proactive attacks, where one side says, okay, we're going to go and attack that enemy there and surprise them and kill them. And then it happens in the other way around. So we are high on one and low on the other. So let me now just think very briefly about proactive aggression and then spend more time thinking about reactive aggression. So I want to talk about the evolution of these two types. And the evolution of proactive aggression, I think, is relatively easy to understand because it's pretty similar to what we see in other animals. Of course, in humans, it takes place at a scale that other animals can't manage. But it's very closely associated with hunting for prey animals in the wild. And humans have been hunting for about 2 million years, maybe more. It makes the hunters good at killing. And if you're good at killing other species, you can be good at killing your own species. Chimpanzees sometimes hunt prey like monkeys and small antelopes, and they are good at killing members of their own species by going out and deliberately finding opportunities to attack and kill them. Wolves do the same thing, and so do many other animals. And if you're thinking that hunters and gatherers don't make sense in terms of proactive aggression, you may be misled by thinking about hunters and gatherers who have been studied relatively recently when they're living as part of a network of societies in which there is some kind of law, some kind of government interference. But if you take a look at the hunters and gatherers who live traditional lives with neighboring societies being other kinds of hunters and gatherers who spoke a different language, then what you see is that they would shoot on sight. They would aim to kill often before they would even find out anything about the person that they had seen. So you have a lot of proactive aggression, which is used for killing in other animals and in humans. You find it all through human societies. And I'm just going to leave that hanging there and then go on to think about the other type, reactive aggression. Because in many ways, it's more puzzling to think about how is it that humans have evolved to be relatively kind and tolerant and cooperative? How do we get to be low on the scale of reactive aggression? So let's have a quick primer on human evolution. 7 or 8 million years ago, we had a chimp-like ancestor. Then for about 4 million years, we had ancestors that we call Australopithecines, who were basically chimp-sized animals that stood upright, but were basically still apes, big mouths and strong arms. And then the genus Homo, to which we belong, began around 2 million years ago. And here is the story that you should remember, that during those 2 million years, or just under, things went sort of changing a little bit during most of that time, but the critical thing that happened was 300,000 years ago when we started the evolution of Homo sapiens. The earliest species, the earliest representatives of our species, Homo sapiens, started around 300,000 years ago. And in between, you got some other species that were much more robust and scary looking than us. Now, people like Margaret Mead have long said that humans are so peculiarly kind and tolerant and unaggressive that we're like a domesticated animal. Many people have said this. And I've studied chimpanzees for many years, and it's very striking how unaggressive we are compared to chimps when we think about reactive aggression. We fight each other, just spontaneously losing our tempers, something like 1,000th of the frequency with which chimpanzees do. We're very striking in this respect. Now, what is so interesting is that we are also anatomically like a domesticated animal. And there are various characteristics here that archaeologists use to recognize domesticated animals in the past when they are confronted with a skull and skeleton. They don't know whether it was wild or domestic. And if it has a lighter body and a short face and small teeth and so on, then they say, okay, that was domestic, because that's what the comparison shows nowadays. Well, humans show the same change as we become Homo sapiens. You can look at the fossil record and we look like a domesticated animal. And here's one example. The face becomes narrower. On the left here, you see a skull of the very earliest specimens that have been attributed to Homo sapiens. And it's a great big wide face with a great big brow ridge and a heavy skull. And these seem to be adapted for fighting. And as you go further on in human evolution towards the right-hand side, you see a much more slender skull that we all have nowadays. And nowadays, you can even say that if people have relatively wide faces, it turns out that in study after study, they tend to be the individuals who lose their tempers just a little bit more easily than people with narrower faces. You can see our evolution still happening. So here's the story. We behave like a domesticated animal. Our anatomy is like a domesticated animal. The evidence suggests that humans actually are a domesticated animal. And what does that mean? It means that somehow we developed the aggressive patterns and the anatomical patterns of domestication, that we are to a Neanderthal as a dog is to a wolf. Not literally to a Neanderthal, because Neanderthals evolved alongside us, but the common ancestor of us and Neanderthals was, as it were, like a wolf to us being a dog. Now, to find out how we can understand this linkage between aggression and anatomy, there's this amazing experiment that many of you may know about by Dmitry Belyaev, a Russian geneticist who started an experiment to find out what would happen if you choose to breed among a captive species only those individuals that are least reactively aggressive. If you select for the least reactively aggressive, as he did with foxes, so he didn't breed from the fearful and aggressive foxes, he just bred from those that were relatively fearless, showed very little aggression towards humans. Then within a few generations, within 10 generations, say, or sometimes even less, you got the features of domesticated animals. What he showed was that if a species evolves less aggression, then it looks like a domesticated animal. So this makes us look at what happened with Homo sapiens 300,000 years ago and say, okay, those wide faces were signals of more aggression, but as we're getting less like the wild ancestor and more like a domesticated species, then aggression will be declining. Now, all the features that are associated with domesticated animals, we won't go through them, but you can say between 20 and 30, and they constitute a domestication syndrome, like the white spot on the head of the goat below and the floppy ears of this dog. These are features that don't occur in the wild, but they do in captive animals. And the examples of the bony changes that I gave are part of this domestication syndrome. And what that experiment showed is that there are two things happen when you select against reactive aggression. One is that you get a reduction in the aggression and fear and the stress response. And this has been seen in many different domesticated animals. But then that's what you select on. That's fine. But what's much more puzzling is the fact that you get a whole series of unselected traits that come along for the ride. Not every one occurs every time, but you get these features that archaeologists use to recognize a domesticated animal and that we now often see in domesticated animals. So you see the white patches and floppy ears and curly tails. You sometimes see these juvenile features, and then you get a reduction in the body mass and face and teeth and sex differences and ultimately brain size that are characteristic of us. So that's just a very quick introduction to the notion of the fact that humans are domesticated, and genetic data are beginning to support this by understanding what are the genes that are found in common among domesticated species compared to their wild ancestors. But in the case of humans, what happened? Why should this have happened around 300,000 years ago? What is it that would have favored us, but not our closest relatives, bonobos and chimpanzees, to become less reactively aggressive? Well, the way that people have answered this is to look at what happens in small-scale societies at people who go against the general tendency, who in fact are very aggressive. How do they deal with that? So these are societies that live without ability to appeal to some police force, without ability to put people in prisons. They're just living on their own, out in what we would think of as the wild. And if someone is a determined bully, then the question is, what can they do? And they will try and cajole them. Come on, who do you think you are, big boots? They'll try and ostracize them. If someone's really bullying, losing their temper, being too aggressive, no one will speak to them. And that very often will work because it's really upsetting to be ostracized. And they can be ridiculed, and sometimes they can just separate. But those lower level efforts don't always work. There are determined bullies, even now, people who are just super aggressive. And what happens to them? Here's an example among the Bushmen of a man who had killed 3 people. And the community decided that they had to deal with it. And you see the quote. In a rare move of unanimity, they ambushed and fatally wounded him in full daylight. If someone is so determined an aggressor that he will punch men to take their wives, that he will steal people's food, that he will insult everybody, that he will respond with aggression when threatened, then ultimately what people do is to exert capital punishment. They kill them. So this gets very fraught. But the short story here is that humans have a unique ability to commit capital punishment. And that unique ability comes from language. Language so sophisticated that people can whisper to each other that really the only thing to do about this awful guy, we've tried everything else, we just got to get rid of him, which is a scary thing to do because you don't want to be betrayed by your confidant. But in fact, this is what happens in small-scale societies. And what this leads to is the use of one type of aggression, proactive aggression, to kill somebody who is excessively aggressive in another way, a reactive aggressor. So I think you can see the way I'm going to say this, that because we're good at proactive aggression, we have had ancestors who've been able to get rid of reactive aggression by killing individuals, and this has evolutionary effects. Because over hundreds of thousands of years, what it means is that the genes of the people who are reactive aggressors become reduced in the population. And what that leads to is self-domestication. And just as you see in animals like Balayoff's foxes, that if you select against reactive aggression, you see the anatomical hints of domestication and the domestication syndrome, so you see it with humans. And ultimately, this has led to a species in which, unlike all the other primates, we have no dominance based on physical fighting ability. Instead, we have males who are relatively egalitarian in their relationships. It means that individuals end up cooperating better within the group. It means that males tend to be very cooperative with each other, but not necessarily with females. You get a tendency of a coalitional patriarchy. And you see that now, even in today's society, in our law, in our religions, in our politics. And then one other thing, and I think this is very important, but I don't want to go on too long, and that is to say that the cumulative effect of the ability of men in a group to conspire to get rid of aggressors and anyone else that they don't like means that there has been the evolution of emotions that make sure that individuals are not too selfish, not merely not too aggressive, but not too selfish. Because once you have the ability of a community to come together and decide to get rid of someone who is too aggressive, they can also do it to someone who is too selfish. And so there's been selection against nonconformist behavior. There's been selection against disruptors and in favor of individuals that invest in the group. So the great moral problem is the relationship between selfishness and investment in the group. And I think what's happened uniquely in humans, unlike any other animal, is that selection has favored individuals who tend to put their own best interests aside, their selfish interests aside, in order to be seen to be investing in the group. And that's because we got such sophisticated language that gives us the opportunity to conspire. So I've done very, very quickly through the paradox. How do we evolve to be at both ends of the spectrum simultaneously? And I think the answer is that we are very low on the scale of reactive aggression. We're high on the scale of proactive aggression. And the way in which we became low on reactive aggression is because we were good at conspiring and killing each other. And that's had all these strange and in many ways wonderful, but also rather daunting effects. So that is my presentation.
So let me start with a question whilst El Rey is sorting out the questions that have come in while she's been talking and are perhaps continuing to come in. So you're saying we're very gentle, but also cold-hearted, premeditative killers. So are we trapped in our violence? Can we realistically become a new peaceful humanity? Or are we doomed because of our evolution?
I think the answer to that doesn't have to go to evolutionary biology, although we can bring it in. But, we know that the amount of violence has declined over the last decades and, more importantly, hundreds of years and almost certainly thousands of years. I'm sure you know Steven Pinker's book, Better Angels of Our Nature, which documents it in really beautifully, as a number of other people have. So how does this square with the fact that there's lots of evidence showing an underlying biology to our aggressiveness? And I think the way in which we square it is this, that our human nature is not going to change. Well, we are who we are. But we can take advantage, and we have taken advantage of the fact that the majority of violence is concerned with proactive aggression. And the great thing about proactive aggression, whether we are humans or other species, is that it's not done in ways that engender a lot of risk for the aggressor. So whether you're a chimpanzee or a wolf or a hunter-gatherer or a modern human, if you see an opportunity to kill that means that you might get hurt yourself, you're probably not going to do it. Of course, there are exceptions in armies where people order others into battle, but in general, it doesn't happen. And so the reason this is important, the reason that it's so vital to understand that people are not just knee-jerk aggressors, but very careful, calculating aggressors. What this means is that as long as we arrange society in such a way that potential aggressors are going to get hurt or caught, or they will become victims of their own aggression in one way or another, whether through legal means or other, then you don't expect people to be proactive aggressors. So the big lesson is, yes, we can design society, we have designed society to reduce aggressiveness. And the trend over the last millennia has been to reduce aggression, and I don't see why we shouldn't carry on being more successful in that direction.
So thank you. So there's hope.
There is hope.
Elray, do you have a question?
Yes. So domestic abuse is a huge issue worldwide, and history is full of one person dominating and abusing another person in slavery. Is there a known connection between the present violence in the world and the past where slavery existed?
I'm not quite sure what the implication is. A connection between, say it again,
Is there a known connection between the present violence in the world
and
the past, where this slavery or this dominating person, the tradition of this dominating person kind of existed?
Yes, okay. Well, I guess my answer to that is the notion that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And this phrase of Lord Acton's seems to me to be an extremely important caution when we think about humans, always. When you have slavery, then you had absolute power corrupting absolutely. The men and women, the families that owned slaves were appalling in the way that they would exploit other humans. But they were no different from humans all over the world who, when given equal opportunities to do that, have the same attitude. And by the way, slavering happens even in hunter-gatherer societies in various different places around the world. So the problem is that there has been an inequitable distribution of power that gives people the opportunity to be corruptly aggressive, as it were, with no disadvantage to themselves. What's the connection to the present? The connection to the present is that the power relationships that existed 200 years ago continue today, although in much more muted form. And so I would see the continuity as being due to the retention of the essential same institutional arrangements rather than anything to do with the passing on of particular genes. Where I think all creatures of our environment, and just as we who are whites in America are descendants of the people who took advantage of slavery. And it gives us very often a power relationship, as we saw with the killing of George Floyd, that continues today.
Thank you. there seems to be a clarification question here. How do we know that hunter-gatherers were apt to shoot on sight?
Oh, there are.
On that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question because this is not widely known, but there are 6 culture areas in the world where you do have some descriptions of the way that people were behaving before the missionaries and the governments and the other kinds of societies that changed things came in. And they're uniform in showing these responses. I mean, there are such sad stories. Inuit who see a man struggling across the ice floes, have to pull him out of the water, and what do they do before he can even open his mouth? They kill him. People were really, really afraid of their neighbors. What I'm talking about is people who spoke a different language, dressed in a different way, who are clearly not members of the larger society to which they belonged. But that's the evidence is clear from these rare places, Tierra del Fuego, the extreme north in Canada, the Andaman Islands, and so on.
Wonderful. Then there's actually a couple of people who've actually asked this question about the difference between matriarchal and patriarchal societies. If you could speak a bit about how that relates to gender or the sex, so males versus females. If you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, okay. So a matriarchal or patriarchal society are societies in which either women, as a sort of coalitionary force, rule the society, or men rule the society. And I've been kind of amazed, asking my classes what percentage of societies they reckon are matriarchal in the world. Because you sometimes get answers up to maybe 10, 15, 20%. But the answer is 0. There are no societies in the world in which women are the rulers. You have individual women who can be queens, but they are propped up by a patriarchal system. Humans are a patriarchal species in the sense that the foreign policy, as it were, is always decided by either males alone or males with some female input. And religions are the result of male decisions. The rules in society that control what other people are doing, and the system of law is embedded in male interests. So you sometimes get societies like the Mosuo of China, where people say, well, aren't they matriarchal because women have a tremendous amount of sexual freedom? But that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is when there is some kind of conflict and the council comes together either to decide on intergroup relationships or solving some legal problem within the group, then it is always dominated by men.
A potential related question is then, why would women who are assertive like men be seen as aggressive and are demonized for this when a man is often praised for the same behavior?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and I feel like an amateur answering it. But to me, the immediate thought I have is that in a society in which men rule, they tend to be threatened by women who are effective at what men do, and so they are very ready to characterize female behavior that is aggressive as inappropriate and improper. This to me goes back to the notion that in our evolutionary past, when a coalition of men discovered, as it were, that they could control even the most individually ferocious and aggressive man, the one who would be the alpha male if he was a chimpanzee, when they discovered they could control him through capital punishment, they also discovered they could control anybody. And although the interests of the community are often served by those male decisions, sometimes they're not. Sometimes those decisions are used to control others in the society that the men don't like, and that includes unruly women. So you see terrible accounts in small-scale society of women being executed for totally arbitrary reasons because they have broken some rule of the men. And I tend to see that kind of domination by coalitions of men, of women, as lingering in unpleasant ways into the present.
So based on your presentation, how do crowd reactions fit into this, like lynch mobs and etc.?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because it is a time when humans behave in ways that are not normally expected, kind of beyond the norm. And when I say it's a time, I mean when you have large crowds, particularly with a tremendous imbalance of power. So people have looked at lynchings and have found that the average number of lynchers per victim at the time that it happened was very high. It was, I think, between 150 and 200. And so it's as if there's some kind of power given by the presence of so many other individuals that enables people to behave in ways that are beyond the moral norm. And what this seems to say is, or it seems to speak to, is the way in which proactive aggression is regulated in our own brains. If we have overwhelming power, then we are prepared to use it to kill members of groups that we revile for one reason or another. And I think what's happening is that if you have a sufficient evidence in your own mind that you are just one of hundreds of people, then somehow the ordinary restraints against killing someone go away. That's the way proactive aggression works in chimpanzees. They never try and kill another individual unless there's a lot of them, but the more there are, then the more likely they are to kill. And I think that in some hideous way, that sort of thing seems to be happening in humans.
So there's been a significant reduction in violent crime in the US since the 1980s. At least some academics have argued that this decline is due to abortion reducing the number of unwanted children. What do you think of this hypothesis?
Well, I don't know a lot about that. I think the idea is that the more single men that you have in society, then the more crime there tends to be. Or more generally, the more violence there tends to be. And of course, this is a very alarming thought from the point of view of what's happening in China, because the one-child policy in China often led to parents having sons rather than daughters, because if they're only allowed one baby, then they would prefer to have a boy for traditional reasons. And what it has led to is a disproportionate ratio in favor of young men. And there are sociologists and evolutionary thinkers who worry about the prospects when you have too many single men. The idea behind the abortion argument was that if you have among the poor people more born, then there you have a lot of men who won't be able to have the resources to be able to marry, so they become single men, and therefore they would be more prepared to use violence to solve their economic, job, whatever prospects. That's the logic. And if you look back in the past, and if you look in societies today where there is a distorted sex ratio for one reason or another in favor of young men, then it's true that you do tend to get some more violence. Whether or not that has applied in the case of the abortion argument, I don't know.
Thank you. I think that I'll give you another 2 questions, and then we'll return to Andrew to kind of have a final question. For those questions that haven't been asked today, we hope to get back to them in a future podcast or something like that with you if possible. So, but I'll just give you another couple of questions if that's okay with you. So, how does our environment and collective experience impact our evolution from proactive aggressors to proactive collaborators? So, in other words, is our collective experience suffering and pain due to our decisions moving us down an evolutionary path?
Well, I don't think it's very useful to think about our evolutionary path in the future because the timescale is just absurdly wrong. You know, if we're going to think about something happening in tens of thousands of years or thousands of years, obviously we can't plan for that. We can't even plan for what's happening in 2 years' time politically. I mean, it's maybe fun to speculate, and I suppose the speculation would be that we will get increasingly reduced in reactive aggression, and that is because even though prisons are full of people who are there not because of their genes, but because of their circumstances, nevertheless, there is probably some genetic component to the fact that some individuals get caught up in criminal activity more than others, and with the very high proportion of young men who are in prison and presumably breeding less than they otherwise would, there may be some evolutionary consequences. But much more important is to think about the way in which proactive aggression is controlled nowadays. And the argument that I would just keep coming back to is that we need societal institutions in order to be able to make those costs too high for the proactive aggressors and keep the benefits to them of proactive aggression being low. If we have treaties and legal systems and all sorts of political arrangements where we can anticipate the possibility of people using their power corruptly and bringing the appropriate sanctions against them, then we can continue to keep proactive aggression in its box. And when I say keep, what I really mean is let's keep it much better in its box in the future.
So, final question from the audience here is that there is a perception by many in the dominant culture that indigenous peoples are more aggressive than those in the dominant culture. How should this be evaluated?
Well, I don't think there's any evidence that there's any kind of inherent greater aggressiveness. You know, the ancient Greeks would talk about barbarians outside their gates being more aggressive. Every society tends to be very biased in favor of its own merits and to downplay the merits of their neighbors. If it is true, and it may be that you can find some comparisons in which some societies are more aggressive than others in terms of the frequency of reactive aggression, say, but particularly of proactive aggression, then I would attribute that to circumstance. And the great merits, I suppose, of the last few hundred years for Western society has been the control of aggression. It's been really terrific. That may seem like a weird thing to say, given that the success of the West has ridden all too much on slavery, which was, of course, a desperately aggressive system. But since then, you do have increasing reduction in the actual portrayal, the actual existence of violence. And Societies do vary in that respect. They vary in the duration and effectiveness of their institutions that control aggression. But it would not be, I think, reasonable to say that any societal variation is due to differences in our fundamental biology or evolutionary psychology.
Well, thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Elray.
So am I unmuted?
You're not.
You're good to go, Andrew.
Okay. So thank you very much. Some very good questions from our audience. I appreciate that very much. So I'm going to just give some personal conclusions from this talk. Our theme for this series is peaceful humanity and new creation. So given our biological evolution, can we realistically become a new peaceful humanity? So the great thing is that our violent evolutionary past does not have to determine our future. Understanding our evolutionary history can help us be realistic about a future that's peaceful. We can do something about our violence. And as you mentioned, institutions like law and courts are important for holding people accountable. I revel in the fact that democracy and elections can remove bad alpha male politicians without bloodshed. So may that happen in some countries in November. And then I think that our DNA story can be expanded by stories of peace and justice making, like Rosa Parks, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Buddha, Jesus, and many others. They show us new possibilities for a peaceful humanity. But I want to end with a question that's the tagline for peace projects. What would you do for peace? So, Richard, could I invite you personally to answer the question, what would you do for peace?
It's a funny question, of course. What would you do if what? You should be asking, what do I do? But maybe that's too pushy. Anyway, I feel somewhat embarrassed in some ways. I was one of the team that discovered that our closest relative, chimpanzees, are extraordinarily violent and go out and make deliberate raids to kill members of neighboring groups. And some people have said to me that this should not be told to people because it's so depressing. What I was impressed by was the fact that the three most senior people involved in that discovery, namely Jane Goodall, David Hamburg, an American, and Robert Hind, Jane Goodall's PhD advisor, all subsequently became major spokesmen for peace, spokespeople for peace, in their various different ways, as UN messengers of peace or chairman of the Pugwash anti-nuclear group or whatever. And I wish I was doing that. But in fact, what I would do for peace and do for peace, I envision a peaceful world in which humans live with other species. And I work for conservation of chimpanzees. And in doing so, I am also involved in a project that my wife and sister started very much, which is to care for the interests of children around the national park in Uganda where I work, because we have to find a way to reconcile the interests of the wildlife and the people that live with them. So my answer is I envision a peaceful world in which it's not just the earth as a giant human feedlot, but it's also an earth for other species as well.
Thank you very much, Richard, for taking the challenge of that question. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're going to do a podcast with Richard at a later date, so watch out for that. And again, let me recommend Richard's book, The Goodness Paradox, which is a very good read. It's readable. It's a book I can read at night and it doesn't put me to sleep. And you can find my review of it on Peace News website if you want to find out more about it.